Socy Dark Talks is back. Open the door and I will tell you 3 terrifying stories of nightmares manifesting in real life. Story 1. The Red Cloth. This is the story of a girl named Amanda Hilton, who lived with her family in an old house in the village of 𝐒𝐈, Scotland. Her life was peaceful until nightmares began to torment Amanda when she turned 10. Each night, when the darkness was thickest, Amanda would sleepwalk under the guidance of a bright red silk fabric. This fabric was not only a companion in each dream, but also seemed to possess a strange power, drawing her to places no child could imagine, from secluded ravines to wild fields under the moonlight. She was drawn into these fantastical dreams and began to look forward to sleeping more often. The frequency of Amanda's sleep increased, causing her parents to worry about her health, but they were unaware of the danger creeping closer to their daughter. One night, when Amanda turned 12 while the whole family was sleeping, they were suddenly awakened by a series of strange noises, more precisely, giggles like those of children and a deep male voice. Following the sounds, Amanda's family discovered her sleepwalking and running around the living room with the red silk tightly wrapped around her neck. She seemed to be choking but still had a naive smile on her face. Without time to understand why, Amanda's parents quickly removed the silk from her neck. Amanda was rescued from the nightmare, her eyes wide open with fear. Tears streaming down her face, she screamed, "It's trying to keep me. It won't let me go home." The room turned icy cold after her panic-stricken words hung in the air. Amanda recounted all the dreams she had experienced and the recent nightmares she had faced. Her family noticed that all these dreams featured the peculiar appearance of a red silk fabric. However, there was no explanation for the origin of this fabric and what it in Amanda's dreams was. On the second night after the strange event, it could no longer contain its eagerness. It once again appeared in Amanda's dreams, this time in the form of her deceased grandmother, and of course the red silk was in this grandmother's hand. It had been 5 years since Amanda last saw her, and she hurriedly ran to her grandmother and hugged her like any other child would. In the dream, Amanda's grandmother smiled a loving smile, mixed with a mysterious, even frightening expression. She lifted the red silk, whispering in Amanda's ear,
"Take this silk to the river, drop it into the water, and I will return to you."
After these whispered words, Amanda woke up in a sweat, feeling the red silk still in her hand. This made her even more confused when she discovered the actual silk was indeed in her hand. With the naivety of a 12-year-old, Amanda could not hide her excitement, knowing that her beloved deceased grandmother would return. Without further thought, she secretly left the house and headed to a nearby lake to do as her grandmother had instructed in her dream. Being afraid of water, Amanda only dared to stand far from the lake and tried to throw the silk into the water from a distance. However, the wind was strong outside, so the silk kept flying back to shore before it could touch the water. Running out of patience with throwing the silk from afar, she decided to grab it tightly and push it deep into the lake with her hands. But as Amanda bent down to push the silk into the water, a strange scene began to unfold. The water seemed to start swirling inward, forming a stronger current than usual. She felt the silk pulling her hand strongly, as if something under the water was pulling it. In a terrified state of mind, Amanda struggled to break free, but the pulling force seemed to grow stronger. Suddenly, the face of her deceased grandmother appeared along with a hoarse voice from beneath the water, as though whispering in her ear,
"Come home, child. Go with Grandma."
This voice was no longer the warm and familiar voice of her grandmother, but a scary, cold, and unfamiliar sound. Amanda realized that the invitation might not have been from the grandmother she loved, but from some dark force using her grandmother's image to lure her into the deep waters. Suddenly, a pale hand reached up and pulled Amanda into the lake. She struggled and screamed with all her might. Her screams echoed in the quiet night, finally waking her parents. They hurriedly ran to the lake, and with the timely help of a few neighbors, they pulled Amanda from the cold grip of the deep water. After the second terrifying event, her parents decided to investigate the origin of the red silk and why it had such an effect on Amanda. The family utilized every connection and visited spiritualists to decipher the mysterious event, but all they received were shakes of the head. During this time, Amanda's psychological state became increasingly unstable as she continued to encounter nightmares. The investigation seemed to hit a dead end until a month later, a meticulously wrapped piece of red silk was placed in front of Amanda's house. The paper was written in shaky handwriting, along with a corner of an old newspaper. The letter was full of slanted, faded lines, but the message was terrifyingly clear, and the most haunting part was the headline of the newspaper, "The Red Silk Case." According to the letter, decades ago, a young woman had used the same red silk to hang herself after being ostracized by her family due to an unplanned pregnancy. Suffering from severe depression and despair, she chose death as an escape and ended her life in the room where Amanda now slept each night. Since then, the young woman's spirit couldn't move on due to her strong attachment to the red silk and the pain of losing the child she never had the chance to meet. She became attached to the children living in the house, seeking the warmth and love she had lost. For Amanda, the silk was not just an object, but a conduit to the spirit world, a channel for that spirit to manifest her presence. After discovering this truth, the family decided they could no longer stay there. They performed a spiritual ceremony to help the young woman's spirit move on, inviting a local priest to pray and release her. The red silk was carefully returned to the old room where the young woman had committed suicide and placed with an apology letter from Amanda's family. The origin of the letter remained a great mystery to Amanda's family. They only saw a small note at the end of the letter. "Dear daughter, please leave." Many hypotheses were proposed afterwards. Perhaps the baby that the young woman had lost had reincarnated as Amanda, and the spirit wanted her child to continue living with a new family. Others thought that the letter might have been sent by the biological mother of the young woman involved in the case. However, Amanda's family did not want to delve too deeply into the letter that had saved their lives. Finally, to avoid any further ties to that painful past, Amanda's family moved away. The house was subsequently demolished, and on that land, the villagers planted a small garden with roses and birch trees, turning it into a place of remembrance for peace and forgiveness, no longer a place that harbored sorrow and ghosts from the past. Story 2. Diana, Mysteries of the Dark. This story tells of Esther, a young assistant who always felt something eerie about Paul's mannequin storage where she worked. The dolls, with their unnervingly perfect appearances, seemed to stare at her whenever she passed by. One evening, as Esther was locking up, she turned off the lights and darkness flooded the room. In the night, she glimpsed the silhouette of a woman standing among the mannequins, but when she switched the lights back on in alarm, the image vanished. The chilling sensation made her shiver. Esther warned Paul about what she saw, but he dismissed it, suggesting it was just a trick of the shadows and light. That night, after Esther had left, Paul stayed behind to check on new stock. While he was arranging things, the lights began to flicker and then went out completely. Before he could react, a cold hand pulled him into the darkness. Paul's screams seemed to be swallowed by the thick walls of the old building. By dawn, only bloodstains were found on the floor, and the shop showed no signs of life. The case was eventually closed as no perpetrator was found. Months after Paul's death, Rebecca, his adopted daughter, lived alone in a small city apartment. In the days that followed, Rebecca was frequently haunted by terrifying nightmares. In each dream, she saw Paul, but not in happy reunions. Instead, she witnessed horrifying scenes of his death. Paul was tortured in various ways, and each time, Rebecca could only watch, tears streaming down her face, paralyzed as her body refused to move to save him, feeling as if she was being crushed under a heavy shadow in both her dreams and reality. Waking from these dreams, Rebecca felt exhausted and her spirit increasingly worn down. 2 months after her father's death, her mother, Sophie, was readmitted to the psychiatric hospital due to a relapse of her condition. Her half-brother Martin, from her mother's side, often spoke of conversations that their mother had with an imaginary friend named Diana. This caused Martin severe insomnia, and he often fell asleep over his school desk. After a conversation with her mother about why she had left home, Rebecca decided to take Martin to live with her. Brett, Rebecca's boyfriend, was not pleased with this decision, believing she was just satisfying her own ego. But Rebecca knew she had to do something to help her brother escape his unnamed fears. On the first night, Martin stayed over. Rebecca was awoken by a fierce scratching at the door. In the dark room, she saw the shadow of a woman reaching out to her. She screamed and turned on the light, but only saw Martin cowering in a corner, terrified. The next morning, when a school counselor came to take Martin home, Rebecca looked down at the floor and saw the name Diana deeply scratched into the wood. The name chilled her to the bone as she suddenly remembered the terrifying memories from her childhood. Diana was not just her mother's imaginary friend. Rebecca recalled that as a child, she too had seen Diana. It was a vague image, but accompanied by a profoundly uneasy feeling she had felt during those dark nights. Her mother, Sophie, used to talk to Diana as if she were a close friend, but whenever Rebecca asked about Diana, her mother just shook her head and said that Diana was a secret that needed to be kept. Determined to uncover the truth, Rebecca began searching through old family documents. She found an old diary of her mother's, which contained pages about Diana, a beautiful but mysterious girl who had vanished suddenly. The diary described Diana as a spirit trapped in this world, warning of a dreadful curse associated with her. Rebecca and Martin decided to learn more about Diana's history. They discovered that Diana had been a close friend of their mother and had disappeared under mysterious circumstances at a church. Rebecca realized that the recent terrifying events, the shadows, the scratching at the door, and the name Diana carved on the floor were not coincidences. She decided to confront the ghost of Diana to free her family from the curse. Rebecca, Martin, and Brett prepared a ceremony to summon Diana and ask her to leave their family alone. They used ancient songs, candles, and protective symbols left by Sophie. As night fell, the darkness deepened, and a cold air enveloped the room. Diana appeared in the flickering candlelight, looking both pitiful and frightening. Her eyes were sorrowful, but they also held anger and pain. She told Rebecca, Martin, and Brett that she had returned not to seek vengeance on the innocent, but to protect them. Diana revealed that she and Paul had been involved. Paul, a charming but calculating man, had taken advantage of her and several other women despite being married to Sophie. When Sophie discovered her husband's infidelities and the betrayal by her closest friend, she had a mental breakdown and began to deteriorate. Diana, overwhelmed by guilt for betraying her friend, decided to expose all of her and Paul's misdeeds. On her way to the court, Sophie visited a church to confess but encountered Paul there. He killed Diana to keep the secret, and her death was disguised as a random accident. Haunted by what had happened, and by her unjust death at the hands of a wicked man, Diana became a restless ghost, not only to seek revenge on Paul, but also to protect Sophie and her children. She told Rebecca that Paul had a long history of affairs, ready to harm any woman who was pregnant with his child. This time, Diana returned to kill Paul because he was threatening others. Diana pleaded with Rebecca and the others to understand that her purpose was not to cause fear or suffering, but to free herself and those she loved. She asked them to perform a final ritual to release her spirit from the earthly bonds. Diana led them to an old church where she had been killed, where they were to use holy water to cleanse and release her spirit. On a silent night, with the help of a priest and ancient prayers, Rebecca, Martin, and Brett conducted the ceremony. As the holy water touched a container holding Diana's symbolic remains, a bright light enveloped the space, and they felt a gentle breeze pass through, bringing a deep sense of peace. As dawn broke, Rebecca, Martin, and Brett felt relief, as if a great weight had been lifted. They knew that Diana was now free, and her spirit would no longer linger in this world. In the hospital, Sophie gently shed tears, looking towards the window and saying, "Goodbye, Diana." Story 3. Whispering Shadows. The Nightmares of Eldridge Lane. When the Henderson family moved into the old Victorian house at the end of Eldridge Lane, they were charmed by its sprawling gardens and the intricate architecture that spoke of a bygone era. The real estate agent had been eager to sell, mentioning only in passing that the house had been unoccupied for years after the sudden departure of the previous owners. It was only after settling in that Daniel Henderson found an old diary in the attic belonging to a boy named Timothy who lived in the house during the 1920s. The entries started cheerfully but grew increasingly troubled, speaking of vivid nightmares that seemed to bleed into his waking days. The first night was restless. Both of Daniel's children, Lily and Max, complained of hearing whispers after midnight, a soft, incessant murmur like wind rustling through dry leaves. Daniel reassured them it was just the house settling, a common occurrence in old structures. Yet, as he lay in bed that night, he too heard the faint echoes of a child's laughter mingling with the whispers. Lily was the first to see him. In her dream, a boy, Timothy, wandered through their garden, looking lost and forlorn. He beckoned her to follow him into the woods behind the house, towards an old, forgotten well. Lily awoke before she saw where he led her, her heart pounding wildly. The next night, Max dreamt of the same boy, who showed him hidden rooms in the house, each filled with strange antique toys that moved on their own. The dream ended with Timothy locking him in one of the rooms, his small face twisted in a mischievous grin. Disturbed by the intensity and consistency of the dreams, Daniel delved deeper into the history of the house. He discovered that Timothy had vanished without a trace one summer, his disappearance never solved, leaving his family to abandon the home shortly afterwards. Neighbors, when pressed, reluctantly shared stories of the house's grim history, unexplained disappearances, strange sightings, and the eerie feeling of being watched. They spoke of the house as if it were alive, aware of its inhabitants and influencing their dreams. As the days passed, the line between dreams and reality began to blur. Lily started sleepwalking, her episodes always leading her towards the woods. Each night, Daniel would find her closer to the old well, murmuring Timothy's name in her sleep. One evening, as darkness fell, Lily didn't stop at the edge of the woods. She disappeared among the shadowy trees, her figure swallowed by the night. Frantic, Daniel and Max ran after her, guided only by the faint sound of her voice ahead. They found her at the well, her eyes wide open but unseeing, hands stretched out towards the dark, open mouth. As Daniel pulled her back, the air turned cold, and a child's voice whispered through the leaves, taunting and cold.
"You found me,"
it said, a chill running down Daniel's spine. Gathering his courage, Daniel shouted into the well, demanding Timothy release his daughter from whatever hold he had on her. The night air trembled with a silent laugh, before Lily suddenly collapsed into Daniel's arms, her eyes closing softly. In the days that followed, the house seemed quieter, the oppressive atmosphere lighter. Lily and Max no longer spoke of Timothy or hearing whispers. It appeared that confronting the spirit had set it to rest. But the peace was short-lived. One evening, as Daniel was tucking Max into bed, he noticed a figure in the garden, staring up at the house. It was a small boy, his expression one of loneliness and mischief. As Daniel watched, the figure slowly faded, but his voice lingered in the wind, promising a return. Daniel knew then that they had not ended the cycle, only paused it. The nightmares of Eldridge Lane were far from over. It just beginning. Months passed with an uneasy calm. The whispers at night returned, softer this time, as if biding their time. Daniel found himself waking at odd hours, his mind filled with images of the well and the woods. The dreams started again, not just for the children, but for him as well. Each dream was more vivid than the last, pulling them deeper into the house's dark history and revealing more about Timothy's sad, eternal wandering. Daniel understood that they were bound to the house, just as Timothy was. The realization that they were part of a larger story, a tapestry of sorrow and mystery woven through generations, weighed heavily on him. He knew they could not simply leave. The house wouldn't allow it. The dreams were a message, a call that tethered them to its melancholic history. Timothy was not just a lost soul, but a sentinel of sorts, guarding secrets too grim for the living to bear. He knew they could not simply leave. The house wouldn't allow it. The dreams were a message, a call that tethered them to its melancholic history. Timothy was not just a lost soul, but a sentinel of sorts, guarding secrets too grim for the living to bear. Determined to break the cycle, Daniel began researching methods to communicate more directly with Timothy's spirit. He invited a medium to the house, hoping to bridge the gap between the ethereal and the real, to negotiate peace with the restless spirit. The medium, an elderly woman with deep, knowing eyes, walked through the house, her expression growing more troubled with each room. Finally, in Timothy's old bedroom, she stopped. She spoke softly to someone unseen, her words a whisper almost lost in the still air. "Timothy," she said, "it's time to let go. These people are not your family. They do not belong to your grief." A cold wind swept through the room, rattling the windows. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it ceased. The medium sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "He's agreed to give you a chance," she told Daniel, "but the rest is up to you. You must make this house a home again, fill it with love and light so no shadows can dwell." Taking the medium's advice to heart, Daniel and his family began the arduous process of transforming the house. They repaired the old damage, painted the walls with bright, cheerful colors, and replaced the somber portraits with vibrant landscapes. Every step they took was a defiance of the house's mournful past. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. The children started to laugh more, their nightmares receding like the tide. The house seemed to breathe easier, its hallways and rooms lighter, as if relieved of a great burden. One night, Daniel woke to the sound of faint whispering. He walked down the hallway, guided by the soft murmur. In the living room, a small figure stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. It was Timothy, clearer now than ever before. "I'm sorry," Timothy said without turning. "I was so lonely. I just wanted to be remembered." Daniel approached slowly, his voice gentle. "You will always be a part of this house, Timothy. But it's time for you to find peace. You don't have to stay here anymore." Timothy turned, a smile breaking through his sadness. "Thank you," he whispered, and then he was gone, his presence dissipating like mist at dawn. The house on Eldridge Lane never whispered at night again. The darkness that had clung to its bones seemed to have finally been exorcised. Daniel and his family continued to care for the house, respecting its history, but filling it with new memories. Years later, people still talked about the house at the end of the lane, but no longer in hushed, fearful tones. Now they spoke of the miraculous transformation of the once dreary mansion into a beacon of joy and renewal. And though the shadows of the past could never be completely erased, the Hendersons had learned that even the deepest darkness could be overcome with persistence and love, proving that even in places as old and mysterious as the Eldridge house, there is always room for a new beginning. Don't forget to like and subscribe our channel so you won't miss out any creepy tales and scary adventures in the upcoming videos. This is Socy Dark Talks. Stay curious and embrace the darkness.